Thank you for joining the American Crochet Association for our Yarn Mastery course. Today's lesson is all about weight, fiber, and color. Yarn is fundamental to crochet. Having a broad understanding of its most basic characteristics is going to be a key factor in mastering crochet. So in this lesson, we're going to cover first and foremost, what is yarn? Then we're going to talk about some of the characteristics that define yarn, like its weight, fiber, and color. What is yarn? Well, yarn is defined as a long continuous length of interlocking fibers, created when individual fibers are twisted together. Yarn is used to create fabrics, and it can be made from various natural and synthetic materials. Before we move further into this lesson, here are some yarn and fabric terms that are really going to help as we dive deeper into yarn. One of the main terms we're going to talk about is ply, and in US terms, it essentially just means the number of strands used to construct a yarn. There are other terms here that are really important, like animal fibers, blends, drape, elasticity, wool, superwash, synthetic fibers, so definitely keep this handy as we're going through the lesson. Next, let's talk about yarn construction. Now, to really understand this topic, grab a few skeins of yarn that you already have, because what we're going to do is check the yarn ends. We're going to check the ends to see how your yarn was constructed and why that matters. Depending on the construction of your yarn, it's going to have a few different characteristics. First, let's look at how many strands or plies were used to create your yarn. Now, if there's just one single strand of fiber or ply used, it's defined as a single ply of yarn. This is also called roving or maybe a raw bundle. Now, if there's two different plies or single strands twisted together, it's going to be called a multiply. Now, I say two or more because you could use any number of plies, 2, 10, 20. Now, if you take those two or more single strands of yarn, and then you twist those strands together, that's what's called a cord. Now, how was that yarn twisted? Or how tightly was it twisted together? That's going to be another defining characteristic. Now, if it's really tightly twisted together, you're going to have a very dense, strong yarn. However, if those plies were really loosely twisted together, you're going to see a much softer, much more lustrous, much more lofty yarn. Yarn can be constructed in multiple ways. We saw that. But here are some construction types that you might find and their definitions for each. Chainette, halo, novelty, ribbon, slub, unspun, S-twist, or Z-twist. Now again, look at how these yarns are constructed, how many plies, what those plies look like, how tightly or loosely they're constructed, and the definitions for each one of these. How your yarn is wound or packaged is going to have a lot of different names. Some of the most common names are hank, skein, cake, and ball. Now we have each one of these represented with a picture, but let's look at the definition for each. A hank is essentially yarn that's wound in a continuous round circle and then twisted into shape. A skein is most likely machine wound, and it's usually constructed with a long body. A cake is something that's very short and wide, and you can typically stack them up really neatly. And a ball is essentially something that is rounder than a cake, and these typically look like a donut. Let's talk about different weight characteristics of yarn. Now, the weight of a yarn is in reference to the thickness or gauge of that yarn. Yarn is classified in 8 main categories. So it starts at a weight 0, and then we go all the way up to a weight 7. There are subcategories for each one of these categories, and they further define the yarn weight or gauge. Let's take a peek at this industry standard yarn weight classification chart. And now the data shown here is from the Craft Yarn Council's guidelines, and it does reflect information collected and shared by industry leaders. So that's where we get most of these numbers. While you're probably familiar with the numbering system 0 through 7, the rest of this chart may seem like a lot of extra information. However, all that extra information just helps us further define the exact weight of any yarn. Just because a yarn is weight 4 medium does not mean all yarns in the weight 4 medium classification are going to be exactly the same. So this just helps us further define a subclassification and then an exact classification by how large a specific yarn is. Now, why do we have all these subcategories? Again, it just helps us to estimate a yarn's individual weight to determine its specific classification. Now, I'm using this picture right here as an example to see what wraps per inch means. It literally means that you have a tool, much like this one here. This is a wraps per inch tool, or you could even use a ruler, something that shows exact inches. So take any yarn and just kind of wrap it around to see how many times that particular yarn wraps around. Now, this particular tool gives you some helpful gauges and guidelines for what classification it is based on how many wraps. But this particular yarn has about 8 wraps per inch. So that means this yarn that I've tried is going to fit into the Aran medium number 4 weight. So all of those classifications help to define this particular yarn. Now, this is a very, very helpful tool, and this is a very helpful method in the manufacturing world. Whenever yarns are being manufactured, this is how they define their classification system. This is also helpful to you as a crochet lover in your pattern choices, especially if you want to substitute. Now we're ready to dive into fiber characteristics. Animal fibers are natural fibers obtained from animals, including alpaca, angora, goat, camel, cashmere, cow, fur, llama, mohair, rabbit, and silk. Those are just a few of the most popular. Now here's a chart just to show you some of those different kinds of animal fibers, different animals within each of those categories, and some of their most common characteristics. For example, the camel family has alpaca and llama, and those particular kinds of fibers are defined as being lustrous, strong, or very heavy. They're warmer than sheep, and they can be classified as wool. While these characteristics may look very generic, it just helps you to have a better understanding for these materials, or for these yarns, and what kind of material you could expect to make from those yarns. Plant fibers are natural fibers obtained from plants, including cotton, bamboo, and linen. Those are just some of the most common. Cotton, for example, has a few different categories. For example, there's Egyptian cotton and Pima cotton. Some of the characteristics of cotton are that it's soft, absorbent, strong. There are a few different types. For example, upland cotton is about 90% of the cotton that you see on the market. It's more of an everyday use. We also have Egyptian, from Egypt, exactly, and Pima, which is an American version of cotton, and this is only represented in about 10% of the items that we see on the market, so it's a little more luxurious. Again, most of these characteristics are just to help you understand the fibers so that you can get an idea for what the fabric may feel or look like. Synthetic fibers are manufactured fibers that attempt to improve upon the naturally occurring plant and animal fibers. And those include rayon, nylon, acrylic, and polyester. Each one of these has some subcategories. For example, rayon has a subcategory of cellulose. Now, cellulose, or rayon, is derived from wood pulp, like pine or spruce. It imitates the feel of silk, wool, cotton, linen, and it's very soft, it's very smooth, and it can be absorbent. However, it does not insulate heat. Most of these characteristics for the synthetic fibers, again, are just going to give you an idea for what these fibers look like, for what they feel like, and the kinds of fabrics they could create. Let's talk about yarn color. Yarn is dyed and constructed in a variety of applications, and each one is uniquely distinct. So we're going to take a peek at some of the most popular different color applications. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a swatch for each so you can see how that colorway works up, but then we're also going to look at that yarn in the skein because sometimes those two things are completely different. Heather is essentially when you interweave colors and produce small flecks of alternate colors. Now, remember I said we're looking at each colorway, not only in the skein, but in a swatch. So that's very important, especially for some colorways, because how something looks in a skein can be completely different when you're actually working it up. Marled is where you take strands of different colored yarns and you twist them together. Multicolored is variegated yarns with two or more distinct hues. Now the color repeats can be short, as shown here. We can see, for example, that the light blue color is only represented in about 3 stitches. Or you can have a very long color repeat, where maybe multiple stitches, dozens of stitches, or multiple rows are represented by a single color. Novelty yarns are going to be yarns that have varying textures, varying fibers, and different colors all spun together. Ombres are gradual blending of one hue to another, usually from a very light color to a dark color. A self-striping yarn is a multicolored yarn. It's dyed with lengths of color that automatically stripe as their work, so you see long color repeats of a single color. A solid is just one unvaried color throughout. Now let's get ready for some action steps so that we can apply everything we've learned in this lesson. Now, take 3 of your favorite yarns, or any yarns really, from the stash that you already have, and what we'd like you to do is read your yarn label and try to define a few things or find a few things that we've learned today. So take those 3 yarns and look at what the weight is. Now, get a WPI tool or just any kind of measuring tool and check the wraps per inch, and especially check that against the weight classification cheat sheet that we've shown you with that WPI information. Take a peek at the fiber that your yarn is made of. Look at the different fiber characteristics from our cheat sheet just to see what kind of fabric that could make. And next, think about the color that your yarn is and see if you can define that color based on the most common colors that we've defined. Please look in your PDF of this lesson for this particular resource page, because when you click on each one of these in your PDF, it's going to redirect you to some additional resources. Now, again, this is just some extra reading, additional resources, or some additional information that will just help substantiate some of the things you've learned in the lesson today. Thank you so much for joining this lesson and the American Crochet Association. And now please come on over and join our community on Facebook to spark a conversation on this topic and also to let us know what you found most valuable within this lesson. Peace, love, crochet. Thank you for joining the ACA, and we'll see you next time.